There is no agony quite like outliving your child. Samuel's heart carried that truth like a wound that would never close as he rode into Maple Creek with nothing but a tired horse and a heart broken clean into. The 58-year-old cowboy had buried his only son with his own hands not a fortnight ago, and every mile since had felt hollow, stripped of purpose. The saddle no longer felt like home. The trail no longer promised adventure. All that remained was annoying emptiness and the dull instinct to keep moving, though he did not know why. The late summer sun sank low across the valley, spilling long shadows over the dusty main street. Samuel's mare limped beside him, her gait uneven, her body bearing the weight of too many miles without rest. He had noticed her stumble earlier that day and knew she would not make it much farther. Truth be told, he was not certain he could either. Maple Creek looked like 100 towns he had passed in the last week's full-fronted buildings leaning against one another like weary companions. A general store with hand-painted signs, a barber's pole slowly fading in the evening light, and the steady clang of hammer against anvil from the blacksmith's shop. Families moved about with the rhythm of routine, women calling children in for supper, men finishing chores at the livery, a few neighbors nodding to one another as they rocked on porch chairs. Samuel felt the familiar sting of eyes upon him. Small towns always noticed a stranger, especially one dressed in dust-stained trail clothes, his face shadowed by grief. Most folks turned away politely, unwilling to invite trouble, but one pair of eyes lingered longer than the rest. Across the street, beside a neat white house with a small garden, a woman in a faded blue dress tended to her flowers. Her brown hair, streaked with gray, was pinned simply, and though her clothing had seen better days, it was clean and mended with care. Something about the way she moved, a deliberate, gentle, unhurried, caught Samuel's attention. She looked up as if sensing him, and for a brief instant their gazes met. He touched the brim of his hat by habit, and she responded with a small nod, not curiosity nor suspicion, but something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps, though they had never met. Shaking off the moment, Samuel led his horse toward the livery. The blacksmith, a broad man with soot on his arms and years of work in his posture, straightened as the cowboy approached. "Evenin'," the man called, setting aside his hammer. "Name's Elias Porter. You lookin' to stable that horse?" "Name's Hart, Samuel Hart," he replied, dismounting with stiff joints that protested every motion. "She went lame about 5 miles back. Thought you might take a look." Porter circled the mare with practiced eyes, lifting the injured hoof and grunting softly. "Stone bruise. Nothing too serious, but she'll need rest. A few days at least, maybe longer." Samuel nodded, pulling coins from his vest pocket less of what he carried. "What'll it cost me?" $2 for the week, feet included. Porter's voice was steady, businesslike. Then, softening slightly, he added, "There's a boarding house down the street. Mrs. Peterson runs it. Beds are clean. Food's decent. Much obliged." With his saddlebag and bedroll slung over his shoulder, Samuel started toward the boarding house, the weight of his son's silver locket pressed against his chest from inside his coat, a constant reminder of the boy he could not protect. The boarding house was exactly what he expected, a 2-story structure with lace curtains in the windows and the faint smell of soap lingering on the porch. Mrs. Peterson herself greeted him at the door, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense expression. "One night, or more?" she asked, appraising him quickly. "Depends on my horse. $1.50 a night. Breakfast included. Supper's extra." She slid a key across the counter. "Second floor, door to the right. No drinking, no gambling, and no women brought in after dark." A ghost of a smile touched Samuel's lips. "Yes, ma'am." The room upstairs was small, a tedious narrow bed with a quilt, a chipped basin on a washstand, and a single chair by the window overlooking the street. Samuel set down his pack, sank into the chair, and pulled out the worn locket. Inside was the only photograph he owned of Jacob, taken 2 years before when the boy turned 22. Dressed in his Sunday best, his son had looked so proud, so alive. The memory struck like a hammer blow. Samuel saw again the ranch accident spooked mare, the violin full, his boy's neck bent at an impossible angle. He had held Jacob's still body in his arms until the warmth left it, then dug the grave himself because he could not bear for another man to do it. Now, all he had left was this locket and a heart held out by sorrow. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. Mrs. Peterson poked her head in. "There's a lady downstairs asking after you. Says she wanted to welcome you to town proper." "A lady?" Samuel frowned. "What lady?" "Miss Bennet, the school teacher, lives across the street." The name meant nothing, but the face did. The woman from the garden. He rubbed his stubble jaw, confused why a school teacher would care about a drifter like him. Still, he nodded. "Tell her I'll be right down." In the parlor, she sat waiting with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Up close, Samuel could see kindness in her brown eyes, but also shadows, the kind that spoke of her own acquaintance with grief. "Mr. Hart," she said, her voice steady but gentle. "I'm Clara Bennet. I hope you don't thank me to forward for calling." "Not at all, ma'am," Samuel replied, hat in hand. "Though I can't imagine what business a teacher has with me." "No business," she admitted, a small smile touching her lips. "I simply thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal. I've a pot of stew on the stove and more biscuits than one person should eat. Would you join me?" Samuel hesitated. He had grown accustomed to silence, to grief solitude, yet there was no pity in her eyes, only genuine kindness. Slowly, he nodded. "That's very generous, Miss Bennet. I'd be honored." Her home mirrored her character, neat, warm, filled with quiet details of care, polished floors with braided rugs, shelves lined with books, and the scent of fresh bread filled the kitchen. The table was already set for two, as if she had known he would come. "Please, sit wherever you like," Clara said, ladling thick stew into bowls. Samuel sat awkwardly, taking in the pressed tablecloth and wildflowers ranged in a small vase. Everything spoke of a woman who found dignity in order, even while carrying loneliness. "This is mighty kind of you," he said, as she set a bowl before him. "No trouble. I rarely have company for supper." She took her place across from him. A pale band of skin on her finger revealed where a wedding ring had once rested. Samuel tasted the stew and let out a quiet sound of appreciation. "Haven't eaten like this in weeks." "Thank you, Miss Bennet." "Please," she corrected softly, "call me Clara." Her gaze lingered on him, attentive, but not intrusive. "You've been traveling long?" "Couple weeks," he said. His voice faltered. Since he stopped, unable to finish, Clara nodded as though she understood without the need for words. "Grief keeps its own time," she murmured. "It cannot be hurried nor reasoned with." He looked at her sharply. "You speak like someone who knows." "I do," she admitted. "My husband passed 3 years ago. Samuel Bennet. He worked at the bank. Pneumonia took him quickly. The first winter we lived here. Cruel, but common." Silence followed, but it was a companionable silence, not heavy. Outside, children's voices carried in the dusk, and somewhere a harmonica played a low, wistful tune. "Did you have children?" Samuel asked, then regretted the intrusion. "We hoped to," Clara said simply. "It was not to be, but I have my stud and sold 23 of them. They keep me busy." Samuel studied her with quiet respect. Here was a woman who had known loss, yet chosen to give her heart to other people's children. There was strength in that, not brittle strength, but enduring, like the roots of an old tree. When she asked if he had family, the question struck like a blow. He set down his spoon with trembling hands. "Had a son," he managed. "Jacob. He was everything good in me." Clara did not speak hollow words of comfort. Instead, she reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, her fingers warm and steady. "I'm sorry," she said simply, and somehow, the weight of those two honest words carried more healing than all the well-meaning condolences he had endured from strangers. When the meal ended, she walked him to the door. The evening air was cool, stars beginning to pierce the velvet sky. "Thank you," Samuel said, struggling to find words. "For supper," and for he trailed off, but she seemed to understand. "You're welcome to come by tomorrow evening if you'd like," she said. I usually sit on the porch after supper. It's peaceful. Samuel touched the brim of his hat. I'd like that, Miss Bennet. Very much. As he walked back toward the boarding house, something stirred faintly in his chest, something he thought had died with Jacob. Not joy, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of hope. Behind him, Clara lingered at her doorway, her hand brushing the chain at her neck where her wedding ring hung hidden beneath her dress. Love lost still lingered in her memory, but perhaps, just perhaps, love had not finished with her yet. Samuel Hart awoke before dawn, as he had done every day of his life since boyhood on the ranch. For a moment, he expected to hear the restless lowing of cattle, the rustle of canvas from a bedroll beneath open stars. Instead, he heard the foreign sounds of town wagons on cobblestone, the crow of a rooster somewhere close, and the faint whistle of the early train. Memory rushed back like a flood. Jacob was gone. The boy's grave lay far behind him, and Samuel was a drifter in a town that wasn't his, surrounded by strangers who had no reason to care. He dressed in silence, buckled on his boots, and descended to the boarding house kitchen. Mrs. Peterson bustled about with brisk efficiency, setting down a plate of bacon and bread before him without ceremony. Sleep well? She asked. Well enough, thank you. After breakfast, Samuel walked the chilly morning air down to the livery. Frost glistened faintly on the rooftops, a whisper of the autumn creeping near. Elias Porter, the blacksmith, was already at work, the ring of hammer on anvil steady as a heartbeat. How's she lookin'? Samuel asked, stroking his mare's neck. Better than yesterday, Porter replied, wiping sweat from his brow. Still favorin' that hoof. I'd give her another couple days, maybe more. Samuel nodded, though the thought of more empty miles weighed heavy. He slipped a coin into the blacksmith's hand for another day's board. Time to heal, Porter remarked casually. The words stuck in Samuel's mind as he turned back toward the boarding house. Time to heal, as if time alone could mend the jagged hole inside his chest. He was lost in thought when he heard a gentle voice behind him. Mr. Hart. He turned and saw Clara Bennet approaching, a small basket in her arms. Her brown eyes held the same quiet concern he had seen the night before. Miss Bennet, he said, tipping his hat. You're out early. I was carrying preserves to Mrs. Henderson. She's been ill. And Clara hesitated, then added softly, I thought you might need some company, or at least a cup of coffee. Samuel nearly declined out of instinct. He had spent weeks keeping his grief locked tight, unwilling to burden another soul with it. Yet something about Clara's presence, steady, gentle, neither pitying nor prying, unraveled his defenses. I wouldn't want to impose, he said. You wouldn't be, she replied simply. Come on, the pot's nearly ready. Her kitchen was warm with lamplight, the smell of ground beans rich in the air. Samuel stood awkwardly just inside the door, uncertain of his place in this domestic scene. Clara looked at him with a small smile. Sit, please. You're making me nervous, standing there like you're about to bolt. For the first time in weeks, Samuel almost laughed. He lowered himself into a chair, feeling oddly out of place, but strangely comforted. Clara poured the steaming coffee into 2 mugs and set one before him. They sat in silence for a while, the steam curling between them, until she asked quietly, Tell me about your horse. She's beautiful. What's her name? Belle, Samuel said, his voice softening. Had her 6 years now, carried me through more country than I can count. She was Jacob's favorite. Her eyes flickered with understanding. Jacob was your son. Samuel nodded. Would have been 25 come Christmas. His voice cracked on the words, but he pressed on. He was everything I wasn't. Steady, kind, good with people. He had plans aspread of his own. Maybe a family someday. Clara's silence was not empty, but inviting, giving him space to speak. Words spilled from him in halting fragments. The cattle drive, the sudden stampede, the hole in the prairie earth, Jacob's horse stumbling, the terrible fall. He died in my arms before I could get him back to town, Samuel said at last, staring into the dark liquid in his cup as though it could erase the image. Without hesitation, Clara reached across the table and laid her hand gently on his. "I'm so sorry, Samuel." Something inside him wavered, fragile as glass. He pulled his hand back, fumbling with his saddlebag, needing a distraction. "I keep meaning to go through his things," he muttered. "Haven't had the heart." The bag slipped from his trembling fingers, its contents scattering across the 4 spare clothes, tools, and a pair of worn leather gloves. Jacob's gloves, still holding the shape of his son's hands. Samuel dropped to his knees with a ragged sound that was half sob, half cry. The memories came like a Fledgecob at 2 years old, riding on his shoulders and laughing at the world. Jacob at 10, practicing to rope his first calf. Jacob at 20, full of plans for the future. And then Jacob still, silent, broken in the dirt. "I failed him," Samuel choked, clutching the gloves to his chest as his body shook. "I was supposed to protect him, keep him safe, and I failed." Clara knelt beside him, her arms coming round his trembling shoulders. Her voice was steady, cutting through his anguish. "No, Samuel, you didn't fail him. You loved him. You raised him to be a good man. That is not failure, that is the greatest success a father can have." He wept then, truly wept, as he had not allowed himself to since the day of the funeral. Clara did not flinch, did not speak hollow comforts. She simply held him, sharing the unbearable weight until his storm of grief began to subside. At last he sagged against the chair leg. Exhausted, Jacob's gloves still clutched tightly. "I'm sorry," he whispered hoarsely. "Don't apologize for grieving your son," Clara said firmly. "Grief is love with nowhere to go. It isn't weakness. Samuel, it's proof of how deeply you cared." Her words struck deep. He lifted his gaze to hers and, for the first time, saw not just kindness, but a reflection of his own pioneer widowhood, her empty hopes for children never born. She understood, not with pity, but with shared loss. "How do you bear it?" he asked, his voice raw. "How do you keep going when everything you love is gone?" Clara was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her words were careful, like stones laid across a river. "You don't bear it. You carry it. Bearing means waiting to put it down one day. But real grief becomes part of you. You learn to carry it with grace, to let it make you gentler instead of bitter. You honor what you lost by choosing to live, even when it hurts." Samuel sat motionless, letting her words seep into the cracks of his soul. It was not healing yet, but it was the first faint suggestion that healing might someday be possible. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted. "You don't have to know how," Clara said softly. "You only have to be willing to try, and you don't have to try alone." That evening, Samuel lay in the small barn behind Clara's house. She had insisted it wasn't Charity command her chicken coop and repair the barn door in exchange for a place to rest. He strung up his canvas tarp for privacy, laid his bedroll in fresh straw, and listened to the quiet stirrings of her cow and hens. It wasn't much, but it felt more like belonging than any place he had known since Jacob's death. As dawn crept through the barn window, Samuel realized that for the first time in weeks, he had slept deeply, not because grief was gone, but because it was finally shared. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the cracks of Clara Bennett's barn, gilding the rough wood and silver. Samuel's heart stirred from his bedroll, the earthy scent of straw, and the quiet cluck of hens greeting him. It was not the vast sky of the open range, but there was comfort, hurrious steadiness he had not felt in years. Buttercup, Clara's milk cow, shifted softly in her stall, and Samuel rose with the ease of old habit, running a hand over the animal's broad side. She turned her head toward him, calm and trusting. He had forgotten how grounding it was to tend to creatures before the day truly began. By the time he stepped into Clara's kitchen, she was already at the stove, the sleeves of her blue dress rolled neatly above her elbows. She looked up with a smile that came easily, without effort. "Morning, Samuel. Coffee's almost ready." "Morning, Miss Clara," he answered, easing into what had become his chair at the small kitchen table. "Smells like heaven in here. Just biscuits and eggs." She poured steaming coffee into 2 mugs and joined him. "Did you sleep well?" Better than I have in months, he admitted. And it was true. Somehow, the quiet rhythm of her home simple act of sharing mornings was stitching pieces of him back together. They sat in companionable silence, sipping coffee while dawn painted the sky outside. After a while, Clara cleared her throat. I was thinking about the loose board on the schoolhouse steps. I'd hate for one of the children to trip. Samuel hid a smile behind his mug. He knew what she was doing, finding him work, giving him purpose. I'd be glad to take a look. In the south, windows stick terribly. It makes it difficult to get air in when the weather's warm. Then I'll bring my tools, he said simply. Her eyes softened. Thank you, Samuel. Later that morning, Samuel walked through Maple Creek with his leather tool roll under his arm. The town was stirring to life, shopkeepers sweeping steps, women hanging laundry, children hurrying toward school with tin lunch pails swinging. He noticed the glances cast his way. Word had spread, as it always did in small towns, that the stranger was living in Miss Bennet's barn. An unmarried woman and a drifter under the same roof. Even with him bedding down in the barn was enough to fuel wagging tongues. But Clara's reputation for decency was strong, and most folks, while curious, offered polite nods as he passed. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a modest white structure with a bell tower rising above it. From the open windows, Samuel heard Clara's voice carrying patiently as she guided her students through arithmetic. It struck him, the steadiness of her tone, firm yet kind, the sort of voice children trusted. He examined the loose step first. It was a simple repair, setting the boards, hammering nails until it held firm. As he worked, he listened to the classroom. 23 take away 15, Clara called. Who can tell me the answer? A chorus of young voices responded. Eat. Very good. And if Mrs. Miller has 23 apples and sells 15, how many does she have left for pies? Samuel smiled at the way Clara framed her lessons, making numbers tangible. She was not simply teaching figure-ish, was teaching children to understand life. Moving on to the stubborn windows, Samuel wrestled with a frame swollen by years of weather. As he pried it loose, he pulled something from his pocket, a small wooden horse, worn smooth by time. He had carved it for Jacob when the boy was 7, and after the funeral, he had found it carefully wrapped among his son's belongings. For weeks, Samuel had carried it like a talisman, but had never shown it to anyone. Now, without quite knowing why, he set it on the windowsill beside him. That's beautiful. He turned. Clara stood in the doorway, her students spilling out for recess. She picked up the toy gently, her fingertips tracing its curves. You made this long time ago, Samuel said, his voice low. For Jacob, he kept it, she murmured, reverent. Children don't hold onto toys unless they mean something. He must have treasured it. He loved horses from the moment he could walk, Samuel said, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. This was the first one that was truly his, even if it was just wood and imagination. Clara looked at him with quiet thoughtfulness. Would you mind if I showed it to the children? Some of the boys have been talking about learning whittling. This would inspire them. Samuel hesitated. The horse felt too precious, too close to Jacob's memory. But Clara's tone was not casually, was respectful, as though she understood the weight of his gift. I suppose that'd be all right, he said finally. Her smile lit the room. Thank you, Samuel. The children will understand the honor. As she carried the wooden horse back inside, Samuel felt a strange thing stir in him, pride, not just in Jacob, but in sharing his son's memory with others. For the first time since the accident, it didn't feel like loss alone. It felt like legacy. That afternoon, while Samuel mended desks inside the schoolhouse, a sudden commotion rose outside. Children gathered beneath the great oak tree, calling urgently, Miss Bennet, come quick. Clara hurried out, Samuel following close behind. A small orange kitten clung high among the branches, mewing pitifully. Oh, dear, Clara murmured, shading her eyes. How on earth did it get up there? Probably chased a bird, one of the girls said, then got too scared to climb down. Samuel studied the tree. The branches were sturdy enough, the height reasonable. It had been years since he had scrambled up after a calf or stray chicken, but muscle memory lingered. "I'll fetch him," he said, shrugging out of his jacket. The children gasped and whispered as he began to climb, careful but sure-footed. The kitten mewed more frantically as he drew near, but did not resist when Samuel scooped it against his chest. "Easy now, little one," he murmured, patting its trembling body. "Nobody's gonna hurt you." When he reached the ground, cheers erupted. Clara's eyes shone with gratitude. "My hero," she said lightly, though the warmth in her voice was real. Several children lingered to thank him personally, their innocent acceptance of him slicing through the armor he had worn for weeks. To them, he wasn't a stranger or a drifter. He was simply Mr. Hart, the man who rescued kittens and fixed windows. Clara fell into step beside him as the children returned to their lessons. "Thank you, Samuel. You didn't have to. Couldn't leave it up there to starve," he replied, though both of them knew his reasons ran deeper. "They adore you already," Clara observed. "You have a natural way with them." Samuel thought of Jacob at the ager, curious, always asking questions. Perhaps his patience with Clara's students came from missing those conversations. Or perhaps it was something else, a stirring of the man he had been before grief hollowed him out. "They're good kids," he said simply. That evening, Samuel joined Clara on her porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. For the first time, the silence between them was not heavy, but peaceful. "Miss Clara," he said softly, "you once told me grief becomes something you carry. I reckon you're right, but it feels lighter when I'm here, with you." Her gaze lingered on the fading sky, then shifted to him. "That's because you're not carrying it alone anymore." Samuel turned his head slowly in his hands, uncertain how to respond. Words failed him, but for the first time in months, he felt the faintest glimmer of belonging. Perhaps, just perhaps, Maple Creek could be more than another stop on a weary trail. The first snow came early that year, drifting down upon Maple Creek until the town looked transformed. White roofs, frosted fences, and icicles gleaming like crystal daggers from the eaves. Samuel Hart woke in Clara Bennett's barn to find the world muffled in silence. The only sound the low murmur of Buttercup shifting in her stall, and the restless cluck of chickens unsettled by the sudden cold. He pulled on his coat and boots, his breath forming clouds in the chill air. For weeks now, he had been mending fences, fixing schoolhouse desks, and earning the trust of townsfolk who once only saw him as a stranger. Somewhere along the way, he had ceased to be simply the drifter in Miss Bennett's barn and had become Samuel's handyman, the man children waved to, the quiet presence who showed up wherever something needed fixing. When he entered Clara's kitchen, the warmth of the stove enveloped him. She was already there, pouring coffee into thick ceramic mugs. Her hair was pinned neatly, but a few silver strands had escaped, softening her face. "Good morning," she said with a smile that reached her eyes. "Morning, Clara," he replied, settling into his chair. They had long since dropped formalities. In the stillness of early mornings and lamplight evenings, first names had become natural. Clara slid his cup toward him. "The schoolhouse stove is giving trouble again. It won't draw properly, and the children were shivering by the time I dismissed them yesterday. I'll take a look after breakfast," Samuel said. "Could be the flue pipes clogged, or the firebox cracked." She watched him with quiet intensity, her fingers circling her own mug. Samuel had learned to read her silences. Something weighed on her. "What is it?" he asked gently. "Besides the stove, I mean." She hesitated, then set her cup down carefully. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday evening. She came to express her concerns about our arrangement." Samuel's chest tightened. He had known this conversation would come. Maple Creek was small. Gossip traveled faster than any train. "She feels," Clara continued evenly, "that it is improper for an unmarried woman to have a man living on her property in the barn. She worries about my reputation." Samuel set his cup down, his hands not entirely steady. "She isn't wrong," he admitted quietly. "I should have thought about what this might mean for you." Clara's eyes sharpened, her voice steady as steel. "She is wrong. She's wrong about you, wrong about me, and wrong about what's happening here. This is my home, Samuel. I will decide who is welcome in it." Her protectiveness startled him. Clara Bennett Gentle, patient schoolteacher, recently revealed the steel spine that had carried her through widowhood and years of leading classrooms. "What did you tell her?" he asked softly. "I told her that my personal affairs are not her business, and if she's worried about impropriety, she might consider the impropriety of gossiping about her neighbors." Despite the seriousness of the moment, Samuel felt a reluctant smile tug at his lips. "I would have liked to see that. I may not have been perfectly Christian in my response," Clara admitted, a touch of color in her cheeks. "But I will not stand by while someone questions your honor mine." Samuel stared at her across the table, a warmth spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with the stove. For weeks, Clara had shown him kindness, steadiness, and patience, but this sure fierce defense of him was something he hadn't known he needed until that very moment. Later that day, while Samuel wrestled with the schoolhouse stove, Clara approached with a photograph in her hands. She set it gently on the windowsill where the light caught it. Samuel looked up and saw Clara as she had been years earlier, younger, but unmistakably her. Beside her stood a slender man with kind eyes, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "Samuel Bennett," Samuel Hart said quietly. Clara nodded. "On our 5th anniversary, we saved enough for a proper portrait. I keep it on my desk, but I thought you should see it." Samuel studied the photograph. "I haven't taken his place," he said, his voice low. "No," Clara agreed softly, "but you've made a place of your own. In this schoolhouse, in this town." Her eyes lifted to his, steady and unflinching. "In my life." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Samuel's heart twisted with conflict, longing, guilt, hope. "Clara," he whispered, "I don't know if I deserve the kindness you've given me." "The fact that you question whether you deserve it," she said gently, "proves that you do." The blizzards came with December, coating Maple Creek in drifts, so high they buried fence posts and sealed doors. The barn became an icebox despite Samuel's efforts to insulate it. So Clara brought him hot bricks wrapped in cloth to ward off the cold. The storm also forced them into closer proximity. In the evenings, Samuel often joined her by the fire while the wind howled outside. It was during one such evening, with snow piling against the windows, that Samuel found his hands whittling wood for the first time since Jacob's death. "What are you making?" Clara asked, glancing up from the children's clothing she was mending. "An angel," Samuel said quietly, "for your Christmas tree." Clara's eyes softened, surprise flickering across her face. "Samuel, you don't have to." "I want to," he said simply. She returned to her sewing, and they sat in comfortable silence. The only sounds the whisper of knife against wood and the snap of fire in the hearth. Outside, the storm raged, but inside there was peace, fragile yet real. When the angel took shape, Samuel held it up. Its face was imperfect, one wing slightly larger than the other, but it was made with care. "She's beautiful," Clara said softly. "What will you call her?" Samuel studied the carving for a long moment. "Hope," he whispered. "Her name is Hope." They decorated the tree together the next day, Clara unwrapping ornaments she had not touched since her husband's death. There were glass balls, paper angels, and wooden stars Samuel Bennett had once painted. "Love isn't finite, Samuel," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "Loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for him, just as loving Jacob never kept you from caring for others. Love grows. It makes room." Her words shook him. They had been dancing round their feelings for weeks, but hearing them spoken aloud, hearing her speak of loving him, brought both terror and joy. He reached for her hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as though they had always fit together. That night, after the decorations were finished and the angel of hope perched at the top, they sat by the fire. Clara leaned against his shoulder, her hand resting lightly on his. For the first time since burying Jacob, Samuel allowed himself to imagine a future not of empty trails, but of mornings filled with shared coffee, evenings by the fire, and laughter returning to the corners of his life. It was dangerous. Hope always wasped as Clara's warmth pressed against him. He realized some risks were worth taking. February settled over Maple Creek with a cruel grip. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the valley, and the cold cut sharper than any knife. Samuel Hart swung his axe behind Clara Bennett's house, splitting wood to keep the stove fed against the bitter winds. His breath came in clouds, his body warm from the labor, when he heard the crunch of wagon wheels over the frozen ground. Looking up, Samuel saw Sheriff Elias Porter climbing down, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the glare of sunlight on snow. His face was set in lines of grim intent. "Morning, Sheriff," Samuel called, leaning on the axe. "Cold one today." "Morning, Hart." Porter's voice carried weight. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded telegram, the yellow paper stark against his gloves. "Afraid this ain't a social call. This concerns you." A knot of dread twisted in Samuel's gut. In his experience, lawmen with telegrams rarely brought good news. "Clara's at the schoolhouse," Samuel said slowly. "We'll hear it together. They found her dismissing her students for recess." Her voice steady as she reminded the children to bundle up against the cold. Her smile faltered when she saw the sheriff's solemn expression. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Best we talk inside," Porter said, tipping his hat. The schoolhouse felt suddenly small as the three adults gathered near the stove. Porter unfolded the telegram and placed it on Clara's desk like a verdict awaiting sentence. This came from Marshall Jenkins over in Cedar Falls. 6 weeks ago, the bank there was robbed, nearly $1,500 stolen, and the clerk shot in the leg. Man may never walk right again. Samuel's blood ran cold. He remembered Cedar Falls vaguely, through a haze of grief and whiskey. He had passed through soon after Jacob's funeral, too dazed to keep track of time or place. "What's this to do with Samuel?" Clara demanded, alarm in her voice. Porter's eyes flicked to Samuel with regret. "Witness says the robber matched your description, Hart. Middle-aged, alone, brown coat, black hat, rode west the same day as the robbery." "That's impossible," Clara snapped, her cheeks flushed with anger. "Samuel would never." Porter held up a hand. "I respect your judgment, Miss Bennett, but I've a duty to ask questions. Samuel, where were you January 15th? Samuel sank into one of the children's desks, his legs suddenly weak. "January 15th, 3 days after he buried Jacob." The world then had been a blur of pain, whiskey, and sleepless nights. "I was in Cedar Falls," he admitted hoarsely. "I bought supplies at the general store, camped outside town, but I never set foot in the bank." "Can anyone vouch for you?" A red-haired clerk behind the counter, a woman buying fabric, an old man arguing about flour prices. But names, times, no. The days blurred together. "I was alone," he said finally, "drinking too much. I can't swear who saw me when." Porter's expression was pained. "Marshall Jenkins wants to speak to you himself. You'll need to come with me to Cedar Falls." Clara's hand shot out, gripping Samuel's arm. "No, there must be some mistake. Surely there's time to prove his innocence. If he runs now, it'll only make him look guilty," Samuel said quietly, covering her hand with his own. "I won't abandon you, Clara, or this town. If I'm innocent, I am truth will come out." Her eyes filled with tears. "What if it doesn't? What if they decide you're guilty anyway? I've only just found you. I can't lose you now." Samuel cupped her cheek, memorizing the warmth of her skin. "Then at least you'll know I stood and faced it. I won't leave you wondering." Porter cleared his throat awkwardly. "We should leave before nightfall. Roads'll be worse by morning." Back at the barn, Samuel gathered the few possessions that mattered. The silver locket with Jacob's photograph, the small wooden horse, the journal Clara had given him for Christmas, its leather cover worn by his hands. These things, more than anything, felt like his life proof that he had lived, loved, and lost. Clara stood in the doorway, tears frozen on her cheeks, her heavy coat wrapped tight round her. "I'll write to you," she whispered, "every day, if they'll let me, and I'll find a way to prove you innocent. Don't make promises you can't keep," Samuel said gently, though his heart swelled at her fierce loyalty. She stepped forward and kissed him, their first kiss. Her lips were soft and warm against his cold mouth, tasting of tears and desperation. Samuel tried to memorize everything, the press of her body, the trembling in her hands, the fierce, unspoken love that passed between them. When they broke apart, Sheriff Porter was waiting beside the wagon. Samuel climbed up beside him, leaving Clara in the doorway of the barn where so many mornings had begun. She pressed her hand to her lips as if holding the kiss safe inside her. Then the wagon turned the bend, and she was gone from sight. The journey to Cedar Falls took 2 days through mountain passes clogged with snow. Samuel lay awake on a narrow bunk in a drafty way station, staring at the ceiling while Porter snored softly across the room. He tried to reconstruct his steps from those terrible weak spying supplies, camping by the frozen creek, riding west at dusk. But the details blurred like smoke in the wind. Porter tried to offer comfort. Jenkins is fair-minded, mostly, but he's under pressure to bring someone to justice. You'll need more than your word. I don't have more, Samuel muttered. I barely have memory. Cedar Falls was larger than Maple Creek, its streets lined with saloons that spilled golden light and raucous laughter into the evening. Samuel tried to recall his last time here, but nothing looked familiar. Marshal Jenkins received them in a tidy office. He was compact, gray-haired, with a mustache that suggested military service. He greeted Porter with courtesy and Samuel with the neutrality of a man trained to weigh guilt. Mr. Hart, he said, opening a file. The witness description fits you. January 15th, 2 o'clock. A man of your age and build entered the bank, demanded money, shot young Harold Morrison when he hesitated, then rode west. I never entered that bank, Samuel said firmly. I bought supplies at the general store that morning. Coffee, hardtack, whiskey, paid with coins. Then I rode back to my camp outside town. I never saw Morrison. Can the clerk confirm? Jenkins asked. Samuel closed his eyes, picturing the red-haired youth behind the counter. Perhaps, but I didn't give him my name. Anyone see you at your camp? No, I chose it to be alone. Jenkins made notes, expression unreadable. We'll check the store. Tomorrow the witness will look at you directly. Until then, you'll stay in our jail. The cell was clean, but cold. A cot and a basin the only comforts. Samuel sat on the bunk, hands clasped, trying to make peace with the possibility he might never see Clara again. He pulled out the small journal she had given him and began to write, his hand steady despite the weight of despair. If anyone reads this and I am not here to speak, know this, I did not rob the bank in Cedar Falls. I may have been lost in grief. I may have drunk too much, but I never took what was not mine. I never raised a hand against an innocent man. He paused, staring at the words. They were true, every one of them, but truth and proof were not the same. He thought of Clara, likely at her window in Maple Creek, wondering if she would ever see him again. He thought of her students, who would ask why Mr. Hart had disappeared so suddenly. He thought of Jacob's laughter, his future cut short, his voice telling his father to keep living. Samuel closed his eyes, alone in the silence of his cell. He whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken in years. Lord, don't let her carry my grief on top of her own. Let her remember me kindly, even if I don't come home. The snow began to fall again outside, muffling the world. Samuel Hart sat in the quiet of his jail cell, clinging to the fading warmth of Clara Bennett's kiss and the fragile thread and of hope that someone somewhere would speak the truth before it was too late. The morning of the hearing dawned gray, the sky low with clouds that threatened more snow. Cedar Falls was alive with restless energy. Word had spread quickly that the drifter accused of robbing the bank was to be judged. Marshal Jenkins escorted Samuel Hart from his cell, his boots echoing against the floorboards. Samuel's wrists were not bound. Jenkins, at least, had afforded him that dignity, but the watchful gaze of armed deputies made the walk feel heavier than chains. They entered the church, the only building in town large enough to hold the crowd. Its vaulted space was packed shoulder to shoulder with townsfolk eager for drama, farmers in patched coats, shopkeepers in Sunday best, mothers clutching children to their skirts. Eyes turned as Samuel stepped inside. At the front sat Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man with a reputation for fairness carved deep in his lined expression. He surveyed the room with a gaze that silenced whispers. "This is an informal hearing," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "We are gathered to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to bind Samuel Hart over for trial on charges of armed robbery and assault." Samuel's mouth was dry. He had no lawyer, only himself, Sheriff Porter, who had escorted him, and the handful of good people willing to speak on his behalf. He turned and scanned the crowd, and there she was. Clara Bennett sat in the third row, her best blue dress pressed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The strain showed in her eyes, but when she met his gaze, she offered a small, steady smile. It was enough to keep him standing. Marshal Jenkins presented the case first. He called Harold Morrison, the bank clerk, to the front. The young man leaned heavily on a cane, his legs still stiff from the bullet wound. His voice wavered with remembered fear. "I'll never forget that face," Morrison declared, pointing straight at Samuel. "He was the one, came in bold as brass, demanded money, shot me when I hesitated. Then he ran." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jenkins pressed the advantage. "You are certain as a man can be," Morrison replied firmly. "I'd stake my life on it." Jenkins laid out the rest of his evidence with tidy precision. Samuel had been in Cedar Falls that day. He admitted it himself. He had no alibi. He had been drinking heavily, his memory unreliable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jenkins concluded, "this is not a matter of doubt. This is a matter of justice. The man who wounded Harold Morrison and stole $1,500 sits before you today." When his turn came, Samuel rose slowly, feeling the weight of 100 eyes. He had never been a man of speeches. Words were clumsy things to him, but truth was simple. "I did not rob that bank," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I was in Cedar Falls, yes. I bought supplies at the general store, coffee, hardtack, whiskey. I camped outside town. I was drunk. I was grieving. But I was not a thief and I was not a killer." He sat again, his heart pounding. Dr. Whitmore Maple Creek's physician stood next. He carried no legal training, but his authority came from years of tending wounds and souls alike. "I have seen what grief can do to a man's mind," the doctor said. "When Samuel Hart arrived in our town, he carried sorrow that would have broken many. He was disoriented, yes, but in all the months since, I have not seen an ounce of violence in him. I have seen kindness. I have seen patience. I have seen a man who mends, not a man who destroys." Sheriff Porter added his testimony. "I've known criminals, real ones. They've a hardness about them, a willingness to hurt others for gain. Samuel Hart isn't built that way. He fixes broken things. He carved a Christmas angel for the children. That's not the hand of a thief." Then the townsfolk of Maple Creek began to rise one by one. The blacksmith spoke of Samuel's honest work. The general store owner testified to his fair dealings. A farmer described Samuel mending his wagon without asking for payment. Each voice chipped away at the picture Jenkins had painted. Finally, a small figure climbed onto a chair so she could be seen. Mary Catherine, one of Clara's youngest students, held up a drawing. "This is Mr. Samuel fixing our school," she said in a clear, piping voice. "He's always helping people. He wouldn't hurt anybody." Judge Harrison examined the drawing solemnly, then handed it back with a faint nod. "Very good work, young lady. Thank you." The innocence of her testimony silenced the room more effectively than any lawyer could have. Samuel felt his throat tighten, his vision blur. These children, these innocents saw him more clearly than anyone else. The judge called for a short recess. As the crowd broke into whispers, Clara found her way to Samuel's side. She reached for his hand, heedless of who might see. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I believe you. With all my heart." Samuel closed his fingers over hers, clinging to the anchor she offered. "Thank you," he said hoarsely, "for fighting for me when the evidence says you shouldn't." "The evidence doesn't know your heart," she replied. "I do." When court reconvened, Sheriff Porter rose again, his expression urgent. "Your Honor, new evidence has come to light during the recess. A witness has come forward who saw the robbery." The crowd erupted in murmurs as a man stepped forward, hat in hand, weathered skin, strong shoulders. A rancher's look. "State your name," Judge Harrison instructed. "William Cartwright," the man said, his voice carrying the flat twang of the prairie. "I run a spread east of Cedar Falls, and I was there that day." Jenkins bristled. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor. We've had no chance to." "Sit down, Marshal," the judge cut in. "We'll hear him." Cartwright's voice grew steadier as he spoke. "My boy was sick. Fever running high. My wife sent me to fetch the doctor. I was riding hard through town when I saw a man come out of the bank, running like the devil was at his heels. He jumped on a horse and tore west." "Was it this man?" Judge Harrison asked, gesturing to Samuel. "No, sir," Cartwright said firmly. "The man I saw was younger, maybe 30, had a scar running down the left side of his face from his eye clear to his jaw. Deep scar. Couldn't miss it. This man," he nodded at Samuel, "ain't him." A murmur swept the room. Samuel's heart hammered so loudly he thought everyone must hear it. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Jenkins demanded. "Because my boy was burning up with fever," Cartwright said, shame coloring his tone. "I got the doctor and never thought on it again until I heard talk of this man being accused. My wife said it would be a sin to let an innocent man hang. So here I am." Porter produced a scrap of fabric, found snagged on the bank store after the robbery. "Doesn't match any of Hart's clothes," he told the judge, "but it's the sort of coat a ranch hand might wear." Judge Harrison examined it, then turned his gaze on Jenkins. "Your identification rests on one wounded clerk and circumstantial timing. Against that we have a credible witness who saw a different man entirely. A scar is not something a body forgets." Jenkins opened his mouth to protest, but the judge's gavel struck. "I find insufficient evidence to bind Samuel Hart over for trial," Judge Harrison declared. "The charges are dismissed. This case is closed." The church erupted. Some cheered, some muttered, but Samuel barely heard any of it. His knees nearly gave way as relief surged through him. "Doctor," Whitmore steadied him, whispering, "Justice has been served today." But Samuel's eyes were fixed only on Clara. She pushed through the crowd, tears streaming freely, joy blazing across her face. When she reached him, she threw her arms round his neck, uncaring who saw. "It's over," she whispered against his ear. "You're free, truly free." Samuel held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, the warmth of her body. For the first time in months, perhaps years, felt as though life had been handed back to him. "We're free," he murmured. "We can finally begin." Round them, the crowd pressed close with congratulations, apologies, and handshakes. But for Samuel and Clara, the world had narrowed to two hearts, beating together in the promise of tomorrow. Spring came early to Maple Creek that year, as if the earth itself had decided to celebrate Samuel Hart's freedom. Snow melted from the valley floor, leaving the grass a tender green, and Clara Bennett's garden began to push up timid shoots of new growth. For the first time in months, Samuel felt air in his lungs that wasn't edged with dread. He walked through town without the weight of suspicion on his shoulders, greeted with nods and handshakes instead of wary stares. Children ran up to him with questions about horses or tools, and their parents spoke his name with a respect he had not expected to earn in any town. Still, it was Clara's presence that anchored him. Her smile across the breakfast table, her hand brushing his when they walked the garden rows, her laughter soft, but growing more frequent, spilling into the quiet evenings by the fire. One evening in late March, they sat on her porch, the sky painted with the pinks and golds of sunset. Samuel reached into his pocket and drew out a small gold band. The metal gleamed softly in the fading light, purchased with the wages he had earned repairing barns and schoolhouse desks. Clara turned toward him, eyes widening as she saw the ring. "Clara," Samuel began, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "These months with you have been the best of my life. I thought my story was over when I buried Jacob. I thought there was nothing left for me but empty trails. But you've shown me there's more. You've shown me I still have a heart, and it's yours if you'll have it. Will you marry me?" Her eyes filled with tears, but her laughter broke through them like sunlight through rain. "Samuel Hart," she whispered, "I thought you'd never ask." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his calloused hands trembling. She leaned forward, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was not desperate this time, but full of hope and promise. They set the date for the first Saturday in June. Clara wanted time to prepare, and Samuel agreed it felt right to let the town share in the joy, to give the people who had stood by him a chance to celebrate. Dr. Whitmore agreed to officiate. Sheriff Porter, with tears glimmering in his eyes, offered to walk Clara down the aisle in place of the father she had lost long ago. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had once gossiped so fiercely, offered her finest tablecloth for the reception as a gesture of reconciliation. But before Samuel could step fully into this new life, there was one thing he had to do. On a bright May morning, he saddled Belle and rode out to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Maple Creek. He carried with him a single wildflower, the first of the season, and the wooden cross he had carved months earlier. Jacob's name burned carefully into its grain. He knelt by the grave he had dug with his own hands. The grass was tender, dotted with tiny blossoms. "Jacob," he said softly, his voice carrying in the still air, "I'm getting married to a good woman, the kind of woman who would have loved you like her own. I hope you'd approve." The wind stirred through the grass, bending the wildflower in his hand. Samuel chose to take it as Jacob's answer, as he had once taken the whisper of the breeze across the prairies as God's voice. "I'll never stop missing you, son," Samuel continued, his hand resting against the cross. "But I'm learning to carry that love forward instead of letting it drag me down. I'll bring her to meet you soon, and maybe, if God sees fit, there will be children to tell stories of their Uncle Jacob." He stayed a long while in silence, the morning sun warming his shoulders, until at last he rose and brushed the dirt from his knees. There was peace in him, no still sorrow, always sorrow but peace too. June arrived bright and clear, the valley bursting with life. The church was adorned with Clara's roses, their fragrance filling the air. Nearly every resident of Maple Creek gathered to witness the union. Samuel stood at the altar in his best suit, the same one he had worn to Jacob's funeral. At first it felt wrong, but as he looked down at the worn cloth, he realized it carried not just grief, but memoria bridge between the son he had lost and the life he was about to begin. The doors opened, and Clara appeared. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered, simple yet radiant. Sheriff Porter walked beside her, pride in his step, tears glistening in his weathered eyes. Samuel's breath caught. She was beautiful, not in the fleeting way of youth, but in the enduring strength of a woman who had known sorrow and chosen joy anyway. Her eyes found his, and in them he saw love, steady and true. At the altar, Porter placed Clara's hand in his. "Take good care of her, my friend," he murmured. "I will," Samuel promised, every fiber of his being behind the words. "Dr. Whitmore's voice filled the church, solemn yet warm. Do you, Samuel Hart, take Clara Bennett to be your wife, to love and to cherish her all your days?" "I do," Samuel said, the words firm, unshakable. "And do you, Clara Bennett, take Samuel Hart to be your husband, to stand beside him in joy and in sorrow?" "I do," Clara answered, her voice steady though tears glistened on her cheeks. "Then, by the power vested in me," Whitmore declared, "I pronounce you husband and wife. Samuel, you may kiss your bride." Samuel lifted Clara's veil and kissed her gently, the church erupting in applause and cheers. In that moment, he felt the circle of his life close and open, all at once, grief and joy interwoven, sorrow and hope joined. The reception filled the schoolhouse with laughter, music, and food laid out by every family in town. Children darted between the tables, women compared pies and casseroles, men raised mugs in toast. Samuel found himself standing in the doorway, watching Clara dance with Dr. Whitmore while the children clapped in time. He shook his head in wonder. "Second thoughts?" Sheriff Porter asked, joining him. "Just the opposite," Samuel replied with a smile. I'm thinking how strange life is. The worst thing that ever happened to me led me Heredo the best thing. Porter nodded, eyes shining. That's the way of it sometimes. Pain and joy, all tangled together until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. As evening fell, Samuel and Clara walked home together, husband and wife. The sky burned gold and crimson, the air rich with the scent of roses. Any regrets? Samuel asked as they settled onto the porch. Their porch now, only that it took us so long to find each other, Clara said, leaning her head against his shoulder. They sat in silence, watching the first stars prick the darkening sky. Tomorrow, their married life would begin work, lessons, repairs, planting, and building. The quiet, steady weaving of two lives into one. But tonight, it was enough to sit side by side, hands entwined, hearts at peace. To broken souls who had found in each other not only healing, but home. The morning after the wedding dawned clear, the valley awash in golden light. Samuel's heart woke in Clara's home, their home now, with the softest disbelief that it was real. For months he had bedded down in the barn, the sounds of animals his only company. Now, the gentle rhythm of Clara's breathing beside him reminded him that solitude was no longer his burden. She stirred as the rooster crowed, her hand seeking his before her eyes even opened. When she found it, her smile bloomed sleepy but radiant. Good morning, husband, she whispered. The word caught him by surprise, filling his chest with a warmth he hadn't known since Jacob's childhood laughter filled the air. Good morning, wife, he answered, his voice husky. They lingered in that golden moment, then rose together to greet the day. Life did not transform overnight into endless ease. Marriage was not a fairy tale, it was a steady weaving of two lives, threads sometimes tangled, sometimes smooth. But for Samuel and Clara, each day brought proof that joy could be found in the ordinary. Samuel threw himself into work with Samuel Bennett's old tools, repairing barns, crafting furniture, and slowly building a reputation as a carpenter worth trusting. Where once he had been seen as an outsider, now folks sought him out, asking his advice on wood grain or hinges. Each coin he earned felt honest and hard-won, not just survival, but contribution. Clara continued her teaching with renewed spirit. Samuel often stopped by the schoolhouse, mending desks or hanging shelves, pausing to listen to the hum of children reciting lessons. He marveled at the way she turned arithmetic into stories, history into living tales. To the children, she was more than a teacher. She was a guide, steady and kind. In the evenings, they sat on the porch as twilight settled, their chairs close together. Sometimes they spoke of their days. Sometimes they said nothing at all, letting the silence be a language of its own. Samuel found that he no longer dreaded silence. Sight was no longer loneliness, but peace. One evening in July, Clara brought out a box from the attic, dusty, tied with a faded ribbon. It looked like it had not been touched in years. These were Samuel's things, she explained softly, setting the box on the table. I couldn't bring myself to open it before, but now I think it's time. She untied the ribbon, and together they sifted through the contents: letters, a watch, a set of wooden stars he had once painted for their Christmas tree. Clara's voice wavered as she recounted small stories: how he whistled while repairing shelves, how he could never cut bread in straight slices. Samuel listened, his hand covering hers, when her voice trembled. At last, she held up a faded necktie, frayed at the edges. He wore this the day we arrived in Maple Creek. He wanted to make a good impression. Her eyes filled with tears, but her smile was tender, not broken. I will always love him, but I love you too, Samuel. That doesn't lessen either love. It deepens both. Samuel nodded, understanding in his bones. I know. I'll always love Jacob. Nothing will change that. But loving you doesn't take from him. It's a way of honoring him, of showing that life doesn't end where sorrow begins. They closed the box together, not as a burial of the past, but as an acceptance of ita memory, now part of their foundation, not their chain. The seasons turned. Autumn brought golden leaves tumbling across the yard, and Samuel built sturdy shelves in the schoolhouse so Clara's students could store their books. Winter came with deep snow, but now Samuel slept beside Clara by the stove, not in a cold barn. One evening during that long winter, as snow piled against the windows, Samuel sat whittling by the fire. Clara looked up from her sewing. "What are you making now?" He smiled faintly. "A cradle, piece by piece, just in case." Her cheeks flushed. Her needle paused mid-stitch. Hope flickered in her eyes, knit demand, not expectation, but the quiet acknowledgement that life might still hold more gifts. By spring, the garden was thriving again. Rows of beans and carrots pushing up under Clara's careful hand. Samuel worked beside her, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands stained with soil. For the first time in decades, he wasn't drifting. He was rooted. Clara straightened, brushing hair from her face. "Do you ever think Jacob would have liked it here?" Samuel's throat tightened, but he smiled. "He would have loved it. He always said I needed to settle down, said I ought to find a good woman before I got too old." Clara reached over, her hand resting lightly against his chest. "Then maybe he'd be glad you listened, in the end." Samuel covered her hand with his own. "I think he would." Their love was not the fiery passion of youth, it was something deeper, steadier. It was in the way Clara saved the best slice of pie for him without asking, in the way Samuel stacked wood high by the porch so she'd never run short, in the way their eyes met across a crowded church or a bustling schoolroom and carried a world of unspoken words. It was a love that knew loss but chose joy anyway, a love that did not erase the past but carried it forward. And as they sat together one evening, watching stars prick the velvet sky, Samuel turned to Clara and whispered, "Home. I never thought I'd have one again, but I do now, with you." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "And I'll never let you forget it." For the first time in his long, weary life, Samuel's heart believed her. By their second spring together, Maple Creek had fully claimed Samuel's heart as its own. Where once he was merely the drifter in Clara Bennett's barn, now he was Mr. Hart, the dependable carpenter who built shelves, mended wagons, and never turned away a neighbor in need. Children ran to him on the street with drawings or questions, their parents tipping hats or waving in greeting. Claire often teased him gently, "You're becoming respectable, Samuel. Before long, they'll be asking you to sit on the town council." He chuckled at that, shaking his head. "I'll stick with my hammer and saw. Thank you kindly. Leave politics to men who enjoy arguing." But though life was steadier than he ever imagined, storms still gathered, storms not of weather, but of flesh and spirit. It began with Clara's cough. At first, Samuel felt little of it, a dry catch in her throat after long days in the chilly schoolhouse. But as weeks passed, the cough deepened, echoing through their home at night when she thought he slept. One evening, when her face flushed with fever after dismissing her students, Samuel insisted she rest while he fetched Dr. Whitmore. The doctor's brow furrowed as he examined her, his hand steady, but his tone grave. "It's not pneumonia, thank heaven. More likely exhaustion and a touch of bronchitis. She pushes herself too hard. Rest, warmth, and patience will mend it." Samuel sat by Clara's bed for days, bringing broth, tending the fire, reading from her books when she was too weak to hold them, her fingers cold around his, her smile wan but grateful. "You fuss like an old hen," she whispered once, her voice rasping. "I'll fuss until you're well," he replied simply. "I've lost enough. I don't plan to lose you." Her eyes softened, and though her cough lingered, strength slowly returned. For Samuel, those weeks carved deeper lines of devotion into his heart. He realized love was not only in shared laughter and quiet evenings, but in vigilance, in care, in holding on through frailty. As Clara regained her strength, another challenge, rosier, different kind of ache. It began one evening in late summer. They sat on the porch, the air heavy with the scent of ripening fruit, fireflies winking across the yard. Clara's hand rested lightly on Samuel's, but her gaze was distant. "You ever wonder," she said softly, "what it might be like if we had children of our own?" Samuel's heart tightened. He thought of Jacob, of his laughter and quick hands, of the dreams he would never fulfill. The longing struck like an old wound torn open. Claire saw the shadow cross his face and touched his cheek. I don't mean to bring you pain. It's only I think sometimes how our lives might have been different. How my house might have been filled with children's voices. Not just in the classroom, but here at home. Samuel covered her hand with his own. I think of it too, more than I admit. But I'm not a young man, Claire, and the Lord hasn't seen fit to grant us that gift yet. Her smile was sad but tender. Perhaps our gift is to love the children we already have, the students who look to me, the boys who bring you scraps of wood to carve into toys. Perhaps that is enough. Samuel drew her close, resting his chin against her hair. Maybe so. And if it is, then I'll count myself blessed. Still, as the fireflies rose, he thought of Jacob, of the grandchildren he would never hold, of the cradle he had once carved just in case. Some grief softened, but never fully released their grip. In the fall, a storm unlike any Maple Creek had seen in years swept through the valley. Winds tore shingles from roofs. Rain turned roads to rivers, and fences splintered under the strain. Samuel worked from dawn to dusk helping neighbors, repairing damage, hauling supplies. His hands blistered, his back ached, but he pressed on. When he returned home late one evening, drenched and bone-tired, Clara met him at the door with dry clothes and warm supper waiting. You can't save the whole town on your own, she chided gently as she helped him peel off wet boots. Feels like I ought to try, he said, collapsing into his chair by the fire. She knelt to rub warmth back into his hands. You've already given them more than they ever expected. Let them carry you now too. He looked down at her, at the woman who had turned his drifting into belonging, and realized she was right. For the first time in his life, he was not carrying everything alone. By winter, the town had recovered, and Samuel and Claire settled into the steady rhythm of married life. Evenings by the fire, mornings with coffee on the porch, small quarrels over where to stack firewood or how much sugar belonged in Clara's pies. But beneath it all was a thread of gratitude so strong it humbled Samuel daily. He had come to Maple Creek with nothing but grief. Now he had a wife, a home, a place. One evening, Claire rested her sewing in her lap and studied him across the lamplight. Do you ever regret it, Samuel? Staying here, tying yourself down after so many years on the trail? He reached across the table, covering her hand. Never. I thought wandering was freedom, but it was just running from pain. Staying choosing to stay with you, that's real freedom. That's living. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. Then we are both free. That Christmas, the children of Maple Creek performed their pageant at the schoolhouse. Samuel had built the stage, and Clara had written the lines. Parents filled the benches, pride glowing in their faces. As the children sang, Samuel felt Clara's hand slip into his. He turned, and she whispered, "Look at them. Look at what we've built, not just you and me, but all of us together." Samuel nodded, emotion thick in his throat. For the first time since Jacob's death, Christmas was not a day of loss, but of renewal. After the performance, little Mary Catherine tugged his sleeve and handed him a folded paper. "I drew you and Miss Clara," she said proudly. He unfolded it to see two figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun, surrounded by smiling children. Crude and simple, but true. "Thank you, darling," Samuel said, his voice rough. "It's the best gift I've ever had." In the quiet after the pageant, as they walked home through falling snow, Clara leaned against him, her breath misting in the cold air. "Do you realize, Samuel, that we're no longer two broken people clinging to scraps of life? We're whole, together." Samuel pulled her close, his heart full. "Ain't about erasing the breaks, Clara. It's about mending. You and me were mended, stronger for it." And as the snow fell softly around them, Samuel's heart knew with certainty he had been given a second chance, and he would spend the rest of his days honoring it. Years slipped quietly through Maple Creek, marked not by wanderings across the plains, but by the steady rhythm of seasons. For Samuel Hart, the once weary drifter, life had become a tapestry of routines stitched with love. Mornings on the porch with coffee and Clara, Afternoons spent over wood at his workbench. Evenings by the fire with books or quiet conversation. Clara's hair grew silver, Samuel's hands more gnarled. But the years had not diminished their bond. If anything, each deepened it. They had learned the contours of each other's souls. Where shadows lingered, where light broke through. Their love was not fragile fire, but enduring ember, steady and warm. One crisp autumn morning, Samuel rose early and saddled Belly older now, her muzzle sprinkled with gray. He rode out to the small cemetery on the hill. Jacob's grave still stood marked by the wooden cross Samuel had carved years ago, weathered now by wind and rain. Samuel knelt, placing a single wildflower at its base as he always did. "Morning, son," he murmured. His voice carried more rasp with each, but the tenderness had not dimmed. "Your stepmother sends her love. She would have adored you, Jacob. I reckon you'd have teased her gentle and made her laugh, the way you always did me." He fell silent, the breeze stirring through the grass. "I miss you still, always will, but I've kept my promise. You've lived. Clara and we've built a life, a good one, and I hope you're proud." For a long moment, Samuel simply sat in the hush of the hill, the weight of grief softened by the steady anchor of love. Then he rose, joints stiff, and guided Belle homeward. Clara greeted him with tea waiting on the porch. She knew where he had been. She always did. She squeezed his hand as he sat beside her, no words needed. Between them, silence had long since become sacred. Later that evening, as Samuel worked by the fire, Clara set aside her sewing and studied him with a faint smile. "Do you realize," she said softly, "we've been married nearly 20 years? He blinked in surprise, then chuckled. "Feels like yesterday some days. Feels like forever others." "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. "Not a single day," he replied. "Even the hard ones, Clara, especially the hard ones. They prove what we had." Her eyes glistened, but her smile never wavered. "Then I count myself the luckiest woman alive." The years brought changes. Clara eventually retired from teaching, though she continued to tutor children in her parlor. Samuel's work slowed as his strength waned, but he still carved toys for the school children and built small gifts for neighbors. Their home remained full not with children of their own, but with laughter, stories, and the affection of a town that had claimed them both. On long summer evenings, children often gathered on their porch steps to hear Samuel tell tales of the trail-off cattle drives and storms, of horses with more spirit than sense, of lessons learned under endless skies. Claire would sit nearby, smiling as she watched their eyes widen in wonder. One boy asked once, "Mr. Hart, did you ever fight Indians or outlaws?" Samuel shook his head. "I fought loneliness, son. I fought grief. And I reckon those are battles every man faces sooner or later." The boy didn't fully understand, but Clara's hand found Samuel's, and in her eyes he saw recognition. One winter's night, after the children had sung carols at the schoolhouse and neighbors had filled their table with pies and preserves, Clara and Samuel sat by the fire, the house quiet around them. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think we'll be remembered, Samuel, when we're gone?" He considered the question, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Not by monuments or books, but maybe by the children you taught. Maybe by the toys I carved. Maybe by the way folks remember a warm meal, a kind word, a place they felt safe." She smiled softly. "That's enough, isn't it?" "That's everything," he answered. Time, relentless and tender, carried them into their twilight years. Samuel's steps grew slower, Clara's eyesight dimmer, yet their love remained unbowed. On their porch one evening, beneath a sky alive with stars, Clara whispered, "We began as two broken hearts, Samuel, but we found our way home." He kissed her hand gently. "You were my home, Clara. You still are." And though years of sorrow and joy had passed, the truth of it shone as brightly as the first day they met in Maple Creek. Love does not erase grief, but carries it. Love does not end with loss, but weaves it into something stronger. Samuel Hart and Clara Bennett lived not as legends, but as proof that even the most weary soul can find rest, that kindness heals, that second chances are real. And when the time came, as time always does, the town of Maple Creek laid them to rest side by side on the hill overlooking the valley. Their graves, simple and unadorned, faced east, where dawn always rose. Each spring, wildflowers grew there, bending in the breeze like whispers of gratitude. Children who had once sat at Clara's desk or played with Samuel's carved toys brought their own children to the hill, telling them of the teacher who never gave up, the cowboy who learned to live again. And so their love endured not just in memory, but in the lives they had touched. A weary cowboy, a kin-hearted teacher, to broken souls who found healing in each other's arms. A story not of fairy tales, but of real grace, carved into the fabric of Maple Creek forever.